Alright. Hi everyone, this is Cindy Flynn, and the topic that I chose is girls with ASD. And specifically, I looked at, do girls with ASD show symptoms differently than boys with ASD? So I looked at several different sources, and one of the things that I found is that there is a 4-to-1 difference in most studies that have been done between boys to girls. So typically what's happened in studies is for every one girl that's diagnosed with ASD, there are 4 boys that are diagnosed. And it's been replicated over and over again in studies. And they're thinking that biases may have influenced this ratio. So the Autism Speaks organization and the Autism Science Foundation co-sponsored a meeting because they wanted to address the differences between boys and girls that have ASD. And they focused on issues that could be addressed with scientific experimentation, including topics that were important to females who have already been diagnosed with ASD. So, and if you're not familiar with Autism Speaks, they have a really good website, a lot of really great information on it. One of the first questions that they asked through this research project was, is there a true sex difference in ASD prevalence? And as I mentioned, the 4-to-1 ratio, it's based on an average from several different studies that were done in the USA as well as internationally. They have diagnostic and ascertainment differences, and they believe that that's accounting for some of the differences with it. But even with that, there was still a 2-to-1 to a 3-to-1 difference. So there's still at least 2 to 3 males for every 1 female being diagnosed with ASD. So the organizations that were co-sponsoring this, they wanted to look further into it. So the second question that they asked was, what is causing this difference in ASD prevalence? One of their theories is that females might be protected against some of the symptoms of ASD. They call it the female protective effect, or FPE. And that also they show different symptoms than what males do. So then the next question, question number 3 that they asked, was how are females with ASD different than males with ASD? So when females are diagnosed with ASD, they tend to have lower IQs and be lower functioning than males who are diagnosed with ASD. And females with an average IQ diagnosed with ASD tend to function better than males with ASD who have about the same IQ level. So what they suspect is going on is that there are behaviors that go undetected. So there are things that for a male that has ASD, people might recognize right away, some of the repetitiveness and the sensory overload and the social situations. People might see that right away and recognize it. But with females, particularly with females that have a higher IQ, it might not be as visible right away. So as I mentioned, those behaviors are getting less detected in females with ASD. They're not showing up as much. Some of the repetitive behaviors that they mentioned, that not only in the study that I looked at for this article, but I read several other articles as well. And so they mentioned things like a female carrying a book around. You know, if a female's constantly carrying books around and reading books, they may not really think anything of it. Most people wouldn't. But if it becomes a consistent thing where they have to have that book and they're carrying it everywhere and they're reading the same book over and over and over again, that's a repetitive behavior that we might not really think as being as abnormal as some of the other things that people with ASD tend to have. Another one was misinterpreting behaviors such as playing with dolls, but not actually pretending. So little girls tend to love to play with dolls. Are they actually pretending with their dolls, though, or are they just reenacting things they've already seen? So that was a key thing, because those with ASD have a harder time with pretending. So if they're just reenacting, maybe they're seeing mom taking care of a younger sibling and they're just acting that out, or they've watched a TV show and they're reenacting that out. If that's what they're doing, then it's really not pretending. Also, Females with ASD tend to be less hyperactive and less aggressive than males. So girls with ASD may be really good at imitating other people. They might fly under the radar. They're causing fewer disruptions in a classroom. So particularly if they are that female with ASD that has a higher IQ, they might be able to function more in a classroom. They're more likely to control their behavior in public. So teachers aren't going to be alarmed. Parents aren't necessarily going to be alarmed. If they've got that higher IQ, they're functioning academically in the classroom well, and the social might not be picked up on quite as much. Also, they might mimic other people for social conversations. As I mentioned a little bit about this earlier too, they might play with their toys differently than other typical children. But you have to closely observe it. Because again, with the book and the dolls, you might not see it right away. You might have to really look at, are they playing with it like a typical child? Or are they playing with it differently? And they also might show their symptoms more mildly than boys do with ASD. Girls with ASD might also have extreme interest. I mentioned the books already, but things like horses, doing hair, playing with dolls, those are all things that a lot of girls have interest in. But for girls with ASD, it's going to be an extreme interest. That's going to be their focus. So like the girl carrying a book around with her all the time. That's going to be what they want to do. They also tend to be quiet, and as I mentioned earlier, not cause those disruptions. They behave appropriately in the classroom. So they're going to go unnoticed a lot more. They may have a harder time catching up socially if they're not diagnosed early enough. All repetitive behaviors should be considered in females. So particularly if you're looking at a female and you're trying to decide whether or not they have ASD, and especially if their IQ is higher, you're going to really want to look at, do they have repetitive behaviors? And is it something that's more socially acceptable, but it's still a repetitive behavior? So females, especially those whose IQs were above 70, may be viewed as more socially presenting less symptoms. So they're not going to show necessarily that they have those symptoms as easily as males with ASD tend to. Their symptoms also might be misinterpreted. So they might be diagnosed with social anxiety or depression or some other kind of diagnosis that really isn't accurate, but it's reflecting what people assume that they are because they're missing all those symptoms that are less visible in females with ASD. Some other differences in females with ASD. I've mentioned this some already, but females have a high IQ. With ASD, they tend to have higher vocabulary and language skills. So they're going to be the social ones. They're going to be the ones talking and able to connect with others. They may also have a better memory, be more flexible. So a lot of times people with ASD have to have that routine. It might not bother them quite as much if they don't have that routine, or they might be better at hiding it because they can mimic others. They're able to communicate better socially than their male counterparts as well. Other differences in females with ASD, they tend to have similar friendships as their peers without ASD, and they have a lot of friends through social media too, and this, from the research that's been done, they suspect that this helps them to feel connected more socially. In fact, the girls that they talked to that had ASD actually commented quite a bit on social media and how it helped them connect. When they weren't necessarily able to form some of those friendships person to person, they could do it online and then make some of those connections from there. So, females without ASD are rarely compared to females with ASD in the field of ASD research. And this is really a pretty big deal, and it was a major concern that was brought up in several of the articles that I read. Because if you're comparing a male with ASD to a male without ASD, and you're doing that on a regular basis, you can get a pretty good idea of what's normal and what's not normal. But if you're not making those comparisons, so if you're not comparing a female with ASD to a female with ASD, it's really hard to get accurate research because females and males are different. We have different ways of doing things. Our minds work differently. So if you're only looking specifically at males, you're going to miss a lot of things with females. And that's exactly what's been happening. So they're trying to do more research to try to find out, well, what does it look like in a girl that has ASD versus a boy with ASD? And in order to do that, they have to compare girls that they would consider quote unquote normal to girls that have been diagnosed with ASD or girls that they suspect have ASD, and then compare those symptoms and see what might be the most accurate. We also know that there are biological and sociological differences, and one of the theories is that this may cause the male-female difference to be inflated, giving an inaccurate view of the rate of males to females with ASD. The study really kind of went back again to, it's all in how you see things. So again, if you're focusing primarily on males, that's the result you're going to get. You have to do kind of a mix of both to really get an accurate result and get the right information that you can use. Question number 4. When do differences emerge in males and females with ASD? So we know that males and females typically start off developing the same. And in males with ASD, typically we've been finding that the symptoms start early on. But one of the big differences that they're finding is with females it might show up in toddlerhood if they're low functioning. But with females, it's not showing up until adolescence or adulthood for symptoms. And that's a key difference because in males, it's showing up in childhood. We're picking up on these symptoms very early on. Some of the need to stick with routine, the hyperactiveness, the aggressiveness, those things are all showing up early on, but in females, they're not. And so the differences aren't coming on till later in life. And this is a problem because this means that females are getting misdiagnosed again, and they're not getting diagnosed at all because their symptoms aren't as prevalent, and we don't recognize those symptoms enough to show that yes, they do have ASD. Question number 5. What are the unique challenges to females with ASD as they transition into adulthood? So really right now we need to do a lot more research to truly address the needs of females with ASD. Studies have been showing females with ASD are able to gain but not easily maintain employment. They may have a lot of other problems socially as well. Even if they don't show it right away, they might have friends, they might make connections with people, but they still have a lot of areas socially where they're struggling. They're just not as apt to show it as a male with ASD. So, in conclusion, more research is needed on the differences between males and females with ASD. Early diagnosis is essential, but females, especially those with higher IQs, are getting misdiagnosed, and they're not getting the help that they need. And females also may not show the same symptoms as males. So as an evaluator, whether you're a teacher in a classroom, if you're a special education teacher, if you're a parent, if you're somebody else out there that's trying to look at somebody and decide whether or not they have ASD, you really need to look closely at that child, especially if that child is female and they have a higher IQ, and look at what that person does. And really consider, are there symptoms here that I'm missing? Is there anything that I'm missing that it could be, so that they're getting the correct diagnosis? Because you also don't want people to end up being diagnosed with ASD that don't have ASD. You want the correct diagnosis so that people can be treated in a way that can help them function to the best of their ability. So my last slide that I have is just the references that I had, and these were definitely some good sources to check out. Thank you.